The elevator hummed, a low-frequency vibration that rattled through the soles of his shoes. Michael gripped the handrail, staring at the polished metal doors. He pulled his phone from his pocket. The screen lit up with a notification. Balance low. He swiped it away, but the number remained burned into his vision. 3 years at this firm, and he had less to show for it than the interns who started last month. The elevator slowed, the floor indicator dinging a sharp, metallic note that sounded like an accusation. Outside, the office floor was already buzzing. He watched through the crack of the opening doors as Sarah walked past, carrying the folder for the project he had proposed 6 months ago. She was laughing, her pace quick and confident. She had been promoted twice since he last saw a raise. He stepped out, his feet feeling heavy on the carpet. The air in the hallway smelled of fresh coffee and expensive perfume, a scent that always made him feel like an intruder in his own workspace. He walked toward his desk, keeping his head down, waiting for the day to end so he could return to his studio and try to ignore the math that kept him awake at night. Rain lashed against the train windows, blurring the city into streaks of gray and neon. Michael squeezed into a narrow seat, his knees pressed against the back of the person in front of him. The air was thick with the scent of damp wool and exhaust. Beside him, an older man sat with a posture that ignored the jolting of the tracks. He gripped a leather briefcase, his knuckles showing no strain. Michael looked at the man, then at the frantic commuters around them. The question felt heavy in his throat, a sudden impulse born of desperation. He leaned over, his voice cutting through the screech of metal on rail. What is the biggest difference between successful people and everyone else? The train lurched, throwing passengers against one another, but the man remained anchored. He turned slowly. His eyes held a stillness that made the surrounding noise seem distant. "They never stop learning," the man said. The words hit Michael with a strange, cooling precision. The train pulled into the station, the doors sliding open with a hiss, but Michael did not move. He watched the man stand and step onto the platform, leaving the crowded carriage behind. The advice echoed in the silence between the heartbeats of the engine. The bookstore was quiet, the air smelling of dry paper and binding glue. Michael walked past the rows of brightly colored covers, his hand trailing along the spines until he stopped. He pulled a single volume from the shelf, its weight surprising him. He sat at his kitchen table, the light from the overhead bulb casting long shadows across the wood. He cracked the spine and started to read. The text spoke of specialized knowledge. He read a paragraph, stopped, and read it again. The words described a method of building a future that felt entirely foreign to the routine he had followed for years. He looked at his hands, then at the scattered bills on the table. It hit him like a physical blow to the chest. He had been trying to navigate a changing world with tools that had rusted a decade ago. He gripped the edges of the book until his knuckles turned white. He grabbed a pen and a blank sheet of paper. He set a rule: 1 book every month, 12 a year, no exceptions. The decision felt like setting a foundation in shifting sand. He closed the book, his breath steady, and stared at the wall, seeing his own reflection in the dark window for the first time in years. The first month passed in a blur of fatigue. Michael brought a book to his desk every morning, hiding it beneath technical manuals. During lunch, while his colleagues laughed in the break room, he sat in his parked car, reading about financial structures and market dynamics. He chewed on cold, leftover noodles, the taste barely registering as his eyes tracked lines of text. The initial intensity began to wane by the 4th month. His eyes burned from long hours of reading under flickering fluorescent lights, and the silence of his apartment felt heavier than before. One evening, after a 10-hour shift, he dropped a book onto his kitchen floor. He stared at the spine, the urge to leave it there and sleep overwhelming his limbs. He stood over it for a full minute, the cold floor biting into his bare feet. He reached down, picked it up, and opened it to the next chapter. He forced himself to read 5 pages, then 10. The grind was not a sudden burst of energy, but a slow daily accumulation of discipline. By the end of the year, his shelves were no longer empty. He had finished 12 books. His notebooks were dense with scribbled strategies, and the initial exhaustion had transformed into a grim, steady focus. 2 years of steady reading changed the way Michael looked at the office floor. He no longer saw a maze of desks, but a series of interconnected systems. During the 3rd quarter meeting, the room was thick with the usual complaints about stagnant growth. His manager sat at the head of the table, tapping a pen against a stack of tired reports. Michael stood up. The sound of his chair scraping against the floor was the only noise in the room. He walked to the front, placed a single document on the table, and began to speak. He did not offer opinions. He laid out a data-driven strategy for cutting overhead costs by 12% without sacrificing output. He spoke with a precision he had learned from a dozen books on management and logistics. The room went silent. His manager stopped tapping the pen. He picked up the report, flipped through the pages, and looked at the numbers, then looked directly at Michael. The silence stretched for 10 seconds, long enough for the air in the room to feel thin. The manager pushed the report back and nodded slowly. A week later, the promotion arrived. Michael walked to his desk, cleared the old paperwork, and sat down as a team lead. He did not celebrate. He simply pulled a new book from his bag and began to prepare for the next challenge. 10 years of discipline had built a foundation that the market was currently trying to tear down. It started with a localized dip in the morning, but by noon, the screens were flashing red. The index plummeted, wiping away years of growth in a matter of hours. Outside the office window, the city seemed to hold its breath. Inside, the sound of the floor changed. The usual hum of business vanished, replaced by the frantic ringing of dead phone lines and the muffled shouting of executives in the hallway. Michael sat at his desk, watching the numbers cascade downward. He saw his competitors' firms shuttering one by one, their assets liquidated as they scrambled for cover. Panic was a tangible weight in the room. He watched his team lead grab his coat and pace the hallway, his face drained of color as he checked his phone every 5 seconds. The collapse was total. It was the scenario he had read about in case studies and historical accounts, but now, it was happening in real time. He felt the cold reality of the situation settle into his chest. This was not a theoretical exercise anymore. He reached into his drawer, pulled out his notebook, and opened to the section he had been refining for years. The test had finally arrived. Michael ignored the ringing phones. He spread 5 books across his desk, their spines cracked from years of heavy use. One offered a framework for supply chain resilience, another for liquidity management, and a third for human resource retention during volatility. He mapped the market crash against these historical precedents. He found the gaps in his competitors' failures and identified the leverage points they had ignored. He worked through the night. By sunrise, he had a new operational roadmap. He drafted a memo, restructured the firm's cash flow, and initiated a total pivot of their service model. The office was a graveyard of abandoned projects and frantic departures, but Michael moved with the certainty of a man who had already lived through this crisis a dozen times on paper. He issued directives, reallocated resources, and redirected the team's focus towards stable, emerging markets. 48 hours later, the bleeding stopped. While his rivals were still filing for bankruptcy, Michael's firm had not only stabilized, but secured a new contract that took advantage of the market vacuum. He closed the last book, leaned back, and watched the market data begin to climb. The theory had held. The preparation had delivered. He was no longer reacting to the crash. He was directing the response. The office floor grew quiet, but the frantic energy of the previous week had vanished. In its place was a steady, rhythmic hum of progress. Michael walked the rows of desks, listening to the sound of his team executing the new strategy. The panic that had shuttered his competitors had become his greatest opportunity. He looked at the quarterly reports coming in. Where others had seen an end, he had found a starting line. He remembered the cramped elevator and the anxiety of his early years, the fear that luck was a closed door he would never open. Now, he understood the truth. Luck was not a random windfall bestowed upon the fortunate. It was the inevitable product of preparation meeting opportunity. He had spent years gathering the tools, building the mental infrastructure, and refining his focus. The market recovery was swift, and his firm led the climb, capturing the territory his rivals had left behind. He stood by the window, watching the city lights flicker to life. He felt the weight of the last decade in his hands, not as a burden, but as a lever. He had mastered the variables that once dictated his life. He was no longer waiting for the tide to turn. He was the one setting the current. Michael stood at the floor-to-ceiling glass, his reflection ghosting over the sprawling city grid. He was 50. The office was silent, save for the low-frequency drone of the climate control system. He traced the skyline with his eyes, identifying the building where he had lived in a studio apartment 2 decades prior. The distance was only a few miles, yet the divide felt like an ocean. He looked at his hands, steady and uncalloused, then back to the horizon. Every major decision, every pivot, every recovery had been built on the pages he had turned in the quiet hours when others were asleep. He had traded 20 years of ink and paper for this view. There were no more bank balance alerts to fear, no more waiting for a promotion that might never come. He walked to his desk, running a hand over the polished mahogany. The freedom he possessed was not a sudden windfall. It was the calculated sum of thousands of individual, quiet choices. He watched the sun begin to dip behind the skyscrapers, casting long shadows across his office. He had successfully mapped his own future. The city below was no longer a labyrinth that trapped him. It was a testament to the discipline that had set him free. A soft knock sounded at the door. A young employee stepped inside, holding a pen, his eyes scanning the expansive office with a mixture of curiosity and unease. He stopped at the edge of the desk. "What is the secret?" he asked. "How did you move from the bottom to here?" Michael opened his desk drawer, pulled out a worn book, and slid it across the polished surface. The younger man glanced at the tattered spine, then looked up at Michael, his brow furrowed. He had expected a complex blueprint, a hidden strategy, or a mention of luck. Michael simply leaned back, his expression steady. "I read one book every month for 20 years. The employee picked up the volume, turning it over in his hands, unimpressed by the simplicity of the answer. He stood there, waiting for the real secret, the one that required no effort. Michael watched him, recognizing the same doubt he had once carried on that rainy train ride years ago. He did not explain further. He did not offer a lecture. He simply smiled, knowing the young man would either discard the book or begin the journey. The habit was simple. The results were monumental. It all started with a single, quiet decision in a bookstore, and now it was his turn to pass the torch.